The air was thick that October evening, the kind of oppressive stillness that clings to your skin and makes you feel as though something's watching. It was days before Halloween, and the town was bustling with preparations. You could smell the pumpkins rotting in the crisp breeze and hear the crunch of dried leaves underfoot. I had no intention of getting caught up in the hysteria. Halloween had never been my thing. Not since what happened. The antique shop sat on the corner of Maple and Ninth, a place no one really visited anymore. A relic of another time, its windows were caked with dust, and the wooden sign out front creaked endlessly on rusted chains. But tonight, for some reason I can't quite explain, the place called to me. Maybe it was the way the dim light flickered in the shop's window, or maybe it was something deeper, something darker. The door creaked as I pushed it open, a sound like bones grinding against each other. Inside it smelled of mold and something else, something metallic. The shopkeeper, a shriveled man with watery eyes, gave me a nod from behind the counter but said nothing. He didn't need to. I wandered aimlessly through the aisles, my fingers brushing over old trinkets, faded books, and chipped porcelain dolls. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the room, sitting alone on a shelf as if waiting for me, was the mask. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. Its surface was smooth, too smooth, almost like flesh. The eye holes were narrow slits, and where the mouth should have been, there was only a jagged crack, as though the mask had been damaged. Yet there was something so alluring about it, something magnetic that drew me in. It was ancient. You could tell by the faint scratches and the darkened patina that covered its surface like a stain. But it wasn't just age that set my teeth on edge. It was the feeling that radiated off it, like the mask was breathing, watching, waiting. I picked it up without thinking, the cool surface chilling my fingers instantly. A whisper, so faint it could have been the wind, seemed to swirl around me. Don't. But I didn't listen. I bought the mask that night. The old man didn't say a word. He took my money, eyes flicking nervously to the mask in my hand, and I left. It wasn't until I got home that the real unease set in. I turned the mask over in my hands again, feeling the weight of it. It was heavier than I remembered. Heavier than it should have been. Still, I wasn't going to let a weird antique ruin my evening. I was heading to a Halloween party after all, and the mask would make the perfect addition to my costume. I pulled it over my face, adjusting it until it fit snugly. The material seemed to mold to my skin as if it were alive. A shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like anticipation. I looked in the mirror and froze. For a second, just a split second, I thought I saw someone else's reflection staring back at me. The eyes behind the mask weren't mine. They were older, colder, full of hate. I blinked and it was gone. The mask was tight, almost too tight, like it was squeezing my skull. I tried to pull it off, but it wouldn't budge. Panic gripped me, my hands fumbling to find the edges, but it was as if the mask had melted into my skin. I clawed at it, the jagged mouth cutting into my fingers, drawing blood. And then, suddenly it let go, peeling away from my face with a sickening wet pop. I staggered back, my heart hammering in my chest. What the hell was that? I tossed the mask onto the bed, wiping the blood from my fingers, and tried to calm down. Just a stupid mask. Nothing more. But deep down I knew better. The party was a blur. People laughed, drank, and stumbled around in cheap costumes. I didn't tell anyone about the mask, about what had happened. No one would believe me anyway. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I got home that night, the house was unnaturally cold. I locked the door behind me and headed straight for the bedroom. The mask was gone. At first, I thought I'd misplaced it, that maybe it had fallen behind the bed or something. But the longer I searched, the more frantic I became. It wasn't anywhere. That's when I heard it. A slow, deliberate dragging sound. It was faint, coming from the hallway just outside my room. I froze, the hairs on my neck standing up. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't footsteps. No, it was more like something heavy was being pulled across the floor. Something limp. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The doorknob rattled, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Then, as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. I stood there, paralyzed, waiting for something, anything to happen. The silence was suffocating. My eyes flicked to the floor, and that's when I saw it. Blood. A thin trail of crimson snaking its way under the door, seeping into the cracks of the wooden floorboards. My heart pounded in my chest and my legs refused to move. I reached for the door handle, fingers trembling, and pulled it open. The hallway was empty, but the blood was everywhere. streaked across the floor, smeared on the walls, leading straight to the attic stairs. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But the mask? I turned to run, but something stopped me cold. In the mirror, there was a reflection. It wasn't mine, and it was wearing the mask. The reflection stood motionless in the mirror, its cold, dead eyes staring into mine, piercing through the thin veil of reality. I blinked hard, hoping, praying that when my eyes opened it would be gone. But no, it remained. The figure behind the mask, a twisted mockery of myself. Its fingers, long and thin, clawed at the edges of the mask, as though it too wanted to tear it off, but couldn't. It smiled, a grotesque, unnatural twist of the lips, splitting the jagged mouth of the mask even wider. My breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to tilt and sway. I stepped back, away from the mirror, away from whatever that thing was. But even as I backed into the hallway, the reflection didn't fade. It followed me, moving closer, though the mirror itself remained where it was. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening, but there was no logic to grasp. A dull thud echoed from upstairs. The attic. I swallowed hard, feeling a cold sweat break out across my skin. The blood trail had been fresh, still glistening in the dim light of the hallway. Whoever, or whatever, had dragged itself up those stairs was waiting for me. My legs felt like lead, but I had to know. I couldn't stay here, not with the reflection leering at me from behind that cursed mask. I took the stairs slowly, each creak beneath my feet sending shivers down my spine. The darkness above seemed alive, pulsing with something ancient, malevolent. Halfway up I paused, straining my ears. There it was again, that dragging sound. Closer this time, just beyond the attic door. The door was slightly ajar, a crack of blackness yawning between the frame. My heart thudded violently in my chest as I reached out, hand shaking, and pushed it open. The attic smelled of rot, decay. The air was thick, almost too thick to breathe, and the darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides. A single faint light bulb swung slowly from the ceiling, casting sickly yellow light in a rhythmic pattern across the room. As it moved, shadows stretched and twisted, creating grotesque shapes that danced on the walls. I saw the mask before I saw anything else. It lay on the floor in the center of the room, perfectly still. The mouth, torn and jagged, seemed to smirk up at me, mocking my hesitation. But it was the shape next to it that stopped me cold. A body. No, not a body. A corpse. The thing on the floor had been dead for a long time. Its skin was shriveled, pulled taut over brittle bones, and its clothes hung in tattered, decaying rags. But the eyes were wide open, bloodshot and bulging, staring straight at the ceiling as if frozen in the last moments of unimaginable terror. Its hand, skeletal with thin strands of decayed flesh hanging from it, was outstretched, as though reaching for something. I forced myself to step closer, every fiber of my being screaming to turn and run. But I couldn't. The mask seemed to pull me in, beckoning with some dark promise I couldn't understand. My foot hit something, and I looked down to see a pile of old, yellowed newspapers scattered on the floor. I crouched, hands trembling as I sifted through them. The headlines screamed at me. Local antique dealer missing. Mysterious disappearance shocks town. And the dates were decades old, the ink smudged and faded with time. But there, on the front page of one of them, was a picture. A picture of the man I had seen in the antique shop earlier that night. The shopkeeper. My stomach twisted as I looked at the photograph, then back at the corpse lying on the floor. It was him. The same man, only now he was nothing more than a decayed husk. And yet, I had spoken to him. I had seen him just hours ago. The mask. It had to be the mask. I stood up, my pulse racing as I backed away from the corpse. That's when I heard it again. The dragging sound. Slow, deliberate, scraping across the wooden floor behind me. My blood turned to ice. I turned, eyes wide, and there it was. The figure from the mirror. It stood in the doorway now, blocking my escape. Its skin, if you could even call it skin, was translucent, stretched too tight over the bones beneath, and its face was hidden behind the mask. The same mask that had been on the floor moments before. Only now it was worn by something far worse than death. The mouth of the mask cracked open, wider than should have been possible, revealing rotted teeth beneath. A low guttural growl escaped from within, echoing around the attic like a death rattle. The eyes behind the mask glowed faintly, pale and empty, as they locked onto mine. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. The figure moved slowly, methodically, each step a deliberate act of terror as it came closer and closer. I looked for something, anything, to defend myself, but the attic was barren, save for the rotting newspapers and the decaying corpse on the floor. Desperation clawed at my throat as the figure reached out, its fingers blackened and shriveled, but strong, unnaturally strong. Then, as if sensing my fear, the figure paused. Its head tilted to the side as though considering something, and then it spoke. Its voice was hollow, like wind through a graveyard, yet familiar. "You brought me back." I froze, every instinct telling me to run, to flee, but my legs wouldn't move. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what it had just said. The mask. The mask had done this. But how? How could something so simple, so innocuous, bring back something so monstrous? The figure took another step, and I felt the cold, wet touch of its fingers on my arm. My skin crawled at the contact, a wave of nausea washing over me. It leaned closer, the mask inches from my face now, and I could smell the stench of decay, of death. "You must finish what you started," it whispered, the voice no longer hollow but full of rage. "Or they will all die." I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The words echoed in my mind. "You must finish what you started, or they will all die." The figure loomed over me, the cold rot of its breath filling the air between us. My muscles refused to obey, frozen by some ancient, primal fear. The mask stared into my soul, its jagged mouth twisting as if savoring my terror. I don't know how I managed to find my voice, but I did. What do you want?" My words were barely a whisper, a pathetic attempt to negotiate with the thing standing before me. The figure's head tilted again, that same eerie, unnatural movement. Its fingers, cold and stiff, tightened around my arm, sending ice through my veins. "You took what was mine," it rasped, the sound like wind through a mausoleum. "Now I take what's yours." It yanked me closer, the force of it sending a shock of pain up my arm. I tried to pull away, but it was like being gripped by a corpse, stronger than any living thing should be. Its face, that mask, drew nearer, the hollow eye slits seeming to pulse with an unnatural hunger. I was close enough now to see the cracks in the mask's surface, dark lines etched deep into the material. Or was it material? Up close it almost looked like skin, pale, lifeless skin. The mouth of the mask twitched, stretching wider, revealing something moving inside. I caught a glimpse of it, dark and slick, writhing just behind the jagged tear. And then I felt it, a sharp searing pain in my chest. I looked down, my breath catching in my throat. Its other hand, the one I hadn't seen, was pressing into my chest, through my chest. Cold, brittle fingers digging into my flesh as if my body were nothing more than soft clay. I gasped, but no air filled my lungs. I was dying. The realization hit me like a freight train. I could feel it, the icy grip tightening around my heart, pulling me away from the world. My vision blurred, the edges of the room darkening, shrinking. My thoughts slowed, my mind drifting toward the blackness that awaited. But then something shifted. The mask's grip loosened, and for a moment I felt a surge of hope. But it wasn't because the figure had stopped. No, it was because it wasn't alone anymore. From the shadows of the attic, another figure emerged. No, others. Slowly, silently, they appeared one by one, their gaunt, lifeless forms stepping out of the darkness like a procession of the damned. Their faces, if you could call them faces, were all covered in masks. Different masks, but all bearing the same horrifying, twisted expressions. Some grinned with unnatural smiles, others scowled with mouths frozen in eternal screams. Their eyes, if they had eyes, glowed faintly from behind the slits, watching, waiting. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, could only watch in mute horror as they circled around me, their footsteps barely a whisper on the wooden floor. They didn't touch me, they didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to suffocate me with fear. The figure holding me spoke again, its voice low and cold. "You're too late." It released its grip on my chest, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The pain was still there, deep and raw, but I was alive. For now. I scrambled backward, my eyes darting between the masked figures. They were closing in, tightening the circle. My back hit the wall, and I knew there was nowhere to go. Then the sound. That horrible dragging sound again. It came from the stairwell from below. Someone was coming up. Slow, deliberate, the sound growing louder with every passing second. My heart pounded in my ears as I turned toward the doorway, dread pooling in my stomach. I didn't want to see who or what was coming, but I couldn't look away. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs. Not like the others. This one was smaller, slumped, dragging something behind it. As it stepped into the light, I felt the bile rise in my throat. It was me, or at least it looked like me. My own face, twisted and gray, the eyes glazed over, lifeless. My doppelganger dragged something behind it, something heavy and wet. I tried to focus, to make sense of what I was seeing, but it was too much. My mind rebelled, refusing to accept the horror unfolding before me. The sound of wet dragging continued as it pulled the object closer, closer to the light. It was a body. And not just any body. It was mine. My own corpse, mutilated, with deep gashes carved into the flesh, the skin peeled back in strips like some grotesque imitation of a Halloween costume. The dead version of myself threw it at my feet, the body landing with a sickening thud, blood pooling around it. I stared, unable to process the horror. The air thickened, the world spinning out of control. I looked up at the figure who had once been me, its empty eyes meeting mine. It stepped closer, raising a hand, my hand, toward the mask. And then it spoke. "You're already dead." The words were a knife to my soul, cold and absolute. The masked figures closed in, their mouths opening in unison, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that hadn't been there before. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My vision blurred again. The shadows swallowing the room, the attic, everything. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was my own face, grinning beneath the mask, as it leaned down, whispering one final bone-chilling word into my ear, "Forever." Then the mask latched onto my face, and everything went black. Darkness. That's all there was. A deep, suffocating void. I could feel the mask, tight against my skin, cold and alive, like a second layer of flesh that wasn't mine. My heartbeat was slowing, a creeping numbness settling into my bones, and my mind felt like it was slipping, unraveling into nothing. But then, something stirred. A flicker of warmth, faint but undeniable, spread through my chest, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through a storm. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a final, desperate trick of the mind before everything faded. But no, it grew stronger, warmer, pulsing like a heartbeat, my heartbeat. Somewhere deep inside me, I found it. A spark. A fight I didn't know I still had left. The mask tightened, as though sensing my defiance, but I wasn't going to let it win. Not now. Not when I could feel the life still burning inside me. With all the strength I had left, I reached up, my fingers trembling as they closed around the edges of the mask. The jagged mouth of it seemed to hiss, the air around me growing colder, but I held on. I pulled. Harder. Harder still. The mask resisted like a living thing, twisting and writhing in my grasp, but I didn't stop. A voice echoed in my head, dark and hollow. "You can't escape. You're mine." But I wasn't listening. Not anymore. With a final desperate cry, I tore the mask from my face. The moment it came free, the world exploded into light. I gasped, air rushing into my lungs, filling me with a sensation so pure, so real, it was like waking from a nightmare. My vision cleared, and I found myself back in the attic. But something had changed. The oppressive weight that had hung over the place was gone. The figures, those masked horrors, they were gone too, vanished like smoke in the wind. I blinked, disoriented, my body shaking as I tried to stand. The mask lay on the floor at my feet, lifeless, no longer the twisted, cursed thing that had clung to me. Just a piece of old, cracked porcelain. I was alive. I was free. But it wasn't just that. The warmth inside me was still there, still growing. It felt different. Like something had shifted, like the curse had been lifted. I touched my chest, expecting to feel the cold imprint of the mask, but instead I felt the steady thrum of my own heartbeat. Strong, full of life. Suddenly the attic seemed brighter, the rot and decay receding as though the very air had been cleansed. I turned toward the stairwell, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I felt hope. Real, tangible hope. As I made my way down the stairs, the air grew lighter, the shadows retreating. When I reached the hallway, the blood trail was gone, replaced by the familiar creaks of old wood underfoot. The door to the outside world was just ahead, and beyond it, I could hear the distant sounds of Halloween night. Laughter, the rustle of leaves, life. But before I could step outside, I heard something behind me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Slowly, I turned around. The old man, the shopkeeper, stood at the bottom of the attic stairs watching me. But he wasn't the decayed corpse I'd seen before. He was whole. His face, no longer a mask of death, was worn but kind, and his eyes held a depth I hadn't noticed before. "You did it," he said, his voice soft but steady. "You broke the curse." I stared at him, still trying to process everything. What was that thing? The old man smiled, though there was a sadness in it. A revenant. The mask brought it back, but only someone strong enough could break its hold. The others weren't so lucky. I glanced back toward the attic, the memory of those masked figures still fresh in my mind. What happens now? He stepped closer, his gaze gentle but firm. You live, and you remember. The mask is no longer a danger to you, but others. Others must be warned. The curse could find another wearer if left unchecked. I nodded slowly, understanding what he meant. The mask, its power, wasn't entirely gone. It had simply been subdued for now, and I couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands. The old man gave me a nod, and then as quickly as he'd appeared, he faded. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, just like the curse. I stood in the hallway for a long time, letting the silence settle around me. The mask lay at my feet, a reminder of everything that had happened. But it was over. I was free. I opened the door, stepping out into the cool October night. The sky was clear, stars twinkling overhead, and the distant sounds of Halloween festivities filled the air. For the first time in what felt like forever, I breathed in deeply, feeling the warmth of life all around me. I smiled. The nightmare was over, and I was still here, alive,